Okay, students, in this video, we are going to continue talking about human language, but this time we are going to combine human language versus other languages. Remember, in the previous video, we looked at differences between animal communication and human language. In this presentation, we are going to look a little bit deeper into human language and more specifically into the question, is it true that every human being has a language? Language arguably is one of the most important distinguishing characteristics of human beings. We use language for many different things. We use it at least in order to communicate, to think, and to show who we are, to which group of human beings we belong or want to belong. It's also very hard to imagine a field in society where no language is used at all. Imagine that. So it is a characteristic not just of human beings but also of human society. Okay? Let's first look at certain things which are called languages in English, but may not really be languages in the sense we want to talk about in this course, okay? Programming languages for computers are, I think, clear examples of those, or the languages of flowers or the language of music. We call them languages in ordinary life, but not so in linguistics or in discourse. What is important for human language is first that there are native speakers, that there are people that learn those languages as infants. Secondly, that one can speak about basically everything in it. That's something we saw in the previous video, remember? And thirdly, that it is carried and recognized by a more or less well-defined group of human beings as their language. There should be some people who say this is our shared language. So what about sign language? Is sign language also a language? You may also wonder whether being spoken is not actually a characteristic of human language. So using speech to transfer my information from my head to your head, isn't that also what human language is about? That is an interesting question, students. Well, if that's what you think, you may wonder about deaf people, okay? Do they have a language as well if they don't hear? Very often, they have sign language. Is this sign language also a language? The first thing you have to understand about that is not necessarily every sign, every gesture I make is a language, but the systems which are used by deaf people in this case are called sign languages, and linguists consider them to be real human languages as well. So they are basically the same as a spoken language with this one difference, that they don't use speech. So pay attention to this. There are many sign languages in the world. Did you know that? And that's another interesting thing about them. So there's a lot of variation in sign language, just as there is in spoken language. We don't know how many different sign languages there are in the world. They are more difficult to count. We know much less about sign languages than about spoken languages, but there must be hundreds of them. Imagine that, people. Furthermore, sign languages have exactly the same kind of functionality as spoken languages. They can be used to express any kind of thought. You can make infinitely many sentences in them. They have native speakers. They are groups of people, deaf communities, who consider them to be their languages. So if deaf people have a language, does that mean that everybody in the world speak a language? Well, I think, unfortunately, that there are some exceptions. They are very few, and they are always people who are suffering from some very physical, psychological, or social impediments, or even some combination thereof. Examples of people suffering from these very strong social impediments are so-called wolf children. And I'm going to talk about that. They are children who grew up without their parents, or where their parents didn't want to speak to them for some strange reason, and this has been investigated. And this is very interesting. They may have been deaf children with hearing parents, where the hearing parents were ashamed of having deaf children. That unfortunately sometimes happens, and it continue happening in the world. If you see the news, you will find that um, sometime there are strange news about these cases in the world. You need to pay attention to those cases on the news, because you are going to become a specialist in the language. So anything that has to do with language is important for us, or is interesting for us, okay? And there may be cases of physical and psychological abuse in these terrible sometimes stories that we can read even in books, okay? I'm going to talk a specific case here, which is the case of Jeannie. This is a very famous example of this for linguists. Is the example of Jeannie. Jeannie was an American girl who was locked up in her room from when she was 20 months old until the age of 13. Imagine that. She didn't have any human interaction in that part of her life. Her parents were kind of crazy. Her father would only bark at her like a dog, and her mother was not allowed to say anything to her. Therefore, she didn't learn any human language during her youth. Also, later on, she was not able, you can see, she was not able to figure out this system of combining all these words into infinitely many sentences. So it is very important that development, as we are children, when we are children, we have a huge capacity to grasp or to develop the language skill. So imagine this girl was not exposed to any interaction, so that's why she couldn't develop this ability of communicating. Fortunately, these are of course very exceptional cases. Something very exceptionally bad must happen to you to end up in such a state. People might also sometimes lose their language. They then, let me pass this slide. They may suffer from a medical condition called aphasia. This is something which usually hits people after they had a stroke. They will lose part of their language capacity because part of their brain or no longer functions. Interestingly, they can be just a very tiny part of using your language. They may use their ability to pronounce, or their ability to understand language, or their ability to speak coherently, or their ability to make grammatical sentences. So they can reveal a message, but their sentences will always be very strange. For example, in the 19th century, the study of such aphasic patients was one way to find out what was the relation between language and the brain, which is something very interesting. What is the relationship between the language and the brain? You can comment this video and let me know your opinion about it. So, after an aphasic patient would die, you would study the brain of the person to see where the problem of that person was. And there are people, scientists, studying that phenomenon. So the answer to our original question, whether all humans have language, seems to be yes. Okay, seems to be yes. Something must be really wrong for a human being not to develop some kind of language. But this raises an additional question. What's the evolutionary origin of language then? Is it as old as us as Homo sapiens? Is it older or is it younger? It's very difficult to decide, students, about this. For instance, because we don't have falsifiable evidence, okay? Language is something abstract. The moment I speak it is already gone. So how can we know what's the origin of language? Of course, there are methods, and they are interesting. It's very interesting to know about it. So let alone that we can reconstruct language of 50, 100,000 of years ago. There are theories. The main division is between continuity-based theories and discontinuity based theories. Continuity-based theories say that language is based on animal communication. It's just somewhat more complicated from of them. Discontinuity theories, on the other hand, say that human language is really something different. Something must have happened in our development to make human language possible. In the 19th century, there was a learned society in Paris, France, which disallowed linguists from even talking about these matters. Because in the past, there were some topics that people can't or couldn't even talk because they were so difficult to decide. In the past few decades, we have started to speculate and think about them again. But still, it's very difficult to give a definitive answer to that particular question. So, students, in this video, we have seen that there's really a very strong link between being human and using language, okay? That is the connection that you need to remember. Almost every human being uses language, even deaf people, okay? As I explained earlier. If you have enough deaf people, they will create and use a sign language, and they are definitely languages as well. We've also seen that those very few humans who don't have a language live in very, very exceptional circumstances. Just as the example that I provided you about Jeannie, okay? It might be either some kind of social condition, as in the case of Jeannie, or some medical condition, as for aphasic patients. Otherwise, being human means using language. So there is a close relationship between being human and using a language. A very obvious next question is, if language is so important, how come we have so many different languages? How? Or why are there so many languages in the world? That's what we are going to continue studying in the next videos, okay, people? So I would like to read your comments about this interesting topic, and definitely linguistics is a very, very interesting field, okay? So let's stop here and let's continue in the next video. Have a good time.